I should have recognized the tone in Marcus's voice when he asked me to help with the garage. 37 years of marriage teaches you the difference between a request and a setup. But I agreed anyway, wiping my hands on the dish towel and following him out to that damp, oil-stained cavern he called his workshop. "Just need you to sort through some boxes while I install the security system," he said, not meeting my eyes. His fingers drummed against his thigh, a tell I'd learned to read decades ago. Something was coming. The garage smelled like motor oil and regret. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, some labeled in my own handwriting from moves that felt like lifetimes ago. Christmas decorations, old tax records, the detritus of a life lived in careful increments. Marcus climbed a stepladder, fiddling with a small device in the corner. The red light blinked once, then held steady. I bent to lift the first box, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back that reminded me I was 61, not 21. "This one's heavy," I called out, but he was absorbed in his work, adjusting angles and testing connections. I opened the box instead. Photo albums from the kids' childhood stared back at me. Soccer games, birthday parties, school plays. All those moments when I thought I knew exactly who I was supposed to be. The concrete floor was cold through my shoes. I pulled my cardigan tighter and kept working, stacking boxes by the wall, creating order from chaos. It was what I did best, what I'd always done. Clean up the mess, make everything presentable, keep the family machine running smoothly. Marcus climbed down from the ladder, brushing dust from his hands. "Someone's coming to help," he said, still not looking at me directly. "Should be here soon." "Who?" "Just someone I know." The red light continued its steady glow, watching over us like an electronic eye. I had the strangest feeling that everything in my life was about to change. The stranger arrived 20 minutes later, parking a dark sedan at the curb. I watched through the garage's side window as he walked up our driveway. Tall, maybe 45, dressed entirely in black. His stride held purpose, like a man who knew exactly why he was there. Marcus stepped outside to meet him. They spoke in low voices, too quiet for me to catch the words, but I saw Marcus nod and point toward the garage, toward me. "Rachel," Marcus called. "This is David. He's here to help with the heavy lifting." David extended his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, working hands. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the dim garage light, and when he looked at me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the flutter of being truly seen by a man. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deeper than I expected, "your husband says you need some boxes moved." I nodded, suddenly aware of my appearance. Gray roots showing, no makeup, wearing my oldest jeans and a faded sweater. When had I stopped caring about how I looked? When had I become invisible even to myself? "The heavy ones are over there," I pointed to the far wall where I'd abandoned the photo albums. David moved past me to assess the boxes, and I caught a hint of his cologne, something woodsy and masculine that made my pulse quicken. I busied myself with a lighter box, trying to ignore the way he filled the space, made it seem smaller and more charged. Marcus had disappeared back into the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see him moving around, but he wasn't watching us. Or maybe he was watching in ways I couldn't see. "Been married long?" David asked, lifting a box that had defeated me earlier. 37 years. "That's a lifetime." 2 lifetimes, I corrected, surprised by the bitterness in my voice. He set the box down and turned to face me fully. You sound like someone who's been thinking about that. I should have deflected. Should have made small talk about the weather or asked about his work. Instead, I found myself studying his face, the lines around his eyes, the way his mouth curved slightly upward, even when he wasn't smiling. Sometimes I wonder who I might have been, I admitted. You still can be. The words hung between us like a challenge. We worked in rhythm for the next hour, him lifting the heavy boxes, me sorting through contents and deciding what to keep. The garage grew warmer as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, and I found myself stealing glances at David as he moved. He was methodical, careful with our belongings in a way that surprised me. When he found a box of my old books, novels I'd collected in my 20s and 30s, he paused to read the titles. Jane Austen, he said, holding up a worn copy of Persuasion. Second Chances. You've read it? My ex-wife was an English teacher. She said Austen understood that people could change even later in life. Your ex-wife was smart. She was, just not smart enough to stay married to me. I laughed, a sound I rarely made anymore. When had laughter become so foreign in my own house? David set the book aside carefully. You should keep this one separate. Some things are too important to store away. I was reaching for another box when he moved closer, ostensibly to help, but his hand brushed mine as we both grabbed the same corner. The touch was electric, intentional. I looked up to find him watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Rachel, he said quietly. I should have stepped back, should have remembered Marcus, the house, the life I'd built box by careful box. Instead, I stayed frozen as David's hand covered mine completely. Your husband asked me to do something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I need to know you want it too. The words didn't make complete sense, but their meaning was clear in the way he looked at me, in the heat of his palm against my knuckles. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. I thought about 37 years of being the good wife, the helpful partner, the woman who cleaned up other people's messes and never made any of her own. I thought about the red light blinking in the corner, about Marcus disappearing into the house, about the careful distance that had grown between us like sediment in still water. Yes, I whispered. David's other hand touched my shoulder, and I leaned into it like a flower turning toward the sun. What happened next unfolded like a dream, or maybe like waking up from one. David's hands were sure, gentle, and I responded to his touch with a hunger that surprised us both. We moved together against the workbench, urgent and desperate, while dust motes danced in the afternoon light. I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, not needed, not depended upon, but desired. David whispered my name like a prayer, and for those stolen minutes, I was not Marcus's wife or anyone's mother. I was simply Rachel, alive and electric and free. Afterward, as we straightened our clothes and tried to pretend the world hadn't shifted, I noticed it again, that steady red glow from the corner where Marcus had been working. The light, I said, pointing. David followed my gaze and nodded grimly. He's been recording. The words hit me like cold water. Recording what? This, us, all of it. I stared at the device, understanding flooding through me like poison. The careful setup, Marcus's sudden departure, David's arrival with his knowing eyes and practiced hands, even his question about what my husband had asked him to do. You knew, I said. It wasn't a question. I knew he wanted to test something. I didn't know if you'd go along with it. But you hoped I would. I hoped you'd choose what you wanted for once. The garage felt smaller now, closing in around us. Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus moving around, probably watching the feed on his computer, seeing everything we'd done. I should have felt shame, should have felt the crushing weight of betrayal and consequence. Instead, I felt oddly light, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for decades. What happens now? I asked. David was already moving toward the door. Now you find out what kind of man your husband really is, and what kind of woman I am. He paused at the threshold and looked back at me. I think you already know. The red light continued blinking, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to whatever came next. I touched my lips, still tender from David's kisses, and waited for my world to end. I found my suitcases lined up in the front hallway when I came inside, 3 of them packed with what looked like a random selection of my clothes and personal items. Marcus stood by the front door, car keys dangling from his fingers like a threat. Efficient, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. He didn't look at me directly. I thought you might want to leave quietly, before the neighbors see the show. There doesn't have to be a show. I walked to the nearest suitcase and opened it. He'd packed my winter coat, 3 summer dresses, and a pair of boots I hadn't worn in 5 years. The randomness of it struck me as almost funny. 37 years, and you still don't know what I actually wear. I know what you did in the garage. Yes, I imagine you have excellent footage. That made him look at me finally. His face was flushed, whether from anger or something else, I couldn't tell. You don't even seem sorry. I considered this, weighing the truth against what he wanted to hear. I'm not sorry it happened. I'm sorry you felt you had to orchestrate it. I had to know. Know what? Whether my wife was a whore. The word hung in the air between us like a slap. I'd been called worse things in my life, but never by someone who claimed to love me. And what's your verdict? Marcus's grip tightened on the keys. You failed the test, Rachel. Or maybe I finally passed one that mattered. He turned toward the door, and I realized he was actually leaving, not throwing me out, leaving himself. The keys were for his car, not mine. Where are you going? Somewhere that makes sense. This is your house too? Not anymore. I watched him walk toward his sedan, the same one David had parked behind just hours ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus driving away in the wake of a man he'd brought here to destroy our marriage. But as his taillights disappeared down our street, I realized he'd miscalculated something fundamental. He'd assumed I would beg, would crumble, would trade my dignity for the security of our shared life. Instead, I felt lighter with each passing minute, as if I'd been holding my breath for decades and could finally exhale. The flames started around midnight. I was sitting in the kitchen drinking tea and trying to decide what came next, when the orange glow lit up the front windows. By the time I reached the porch, David's car was fully engulfed. Marcus stood across the street, silhouetted against the fire, watching his handiwork with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally made his point. The neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the spectacle and the smell of burning metal and upholstery. I should have called the fire department, should have run inside and hidden from the shame of it all. Instead, I walked down to the curb and stood watching the destruction, feeling oddly peaceful. Mrs. Peterson, our neighbor Janet, appeared at my elbow, clutching a robe around herself. Should we call someone? It's handled, I said. The flames reflected in Marcus's eyes as he stared across the street at me. Even from that distance, I could see the fury and disappointment warring in his expression. He'd wanted me to break, to come running and begging for forgiveness. Instead, I stood witness to his tantrum with the calm of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. Or maybe I'd finally found it. The fire department arrived eventually, though there wasn't much left to save. By morning, David's car was a blackened skeleton on the asphalt, and Marcus was gone. He'd left no note, no forwarding address, just the lingering smell of smoke and the memory of flames dancing in his eyes. I spent that first day alone calling lawyers and insurance companies, handling the practical aftermath of a marriage that had combusted as surely as the car in my driveway. By evening, I realized something that should have terrified me, but didn't. I had no idea what came next. For the first time in 37 years, my life was entirely my own. I made dinner for one, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, and sat on my back porch watching the sunset over a future I couldn't predict. Somewhere in the city, Marcus was probably telling himself he'd won, that he'd exposed me for what I really was. He was right, in a way. He had exposed me, but what he'd revealed wasn't the whore he'd expected to find. It was a woman who'd been buried so long under duty and compromise that I'd forgotten she existed. The woman who'd said yes in the garage. The woman who'd chosen desire over safety, truth over performance. The woman who would be alone for a long time, but alone as herself rather than invisible in someone else's story. I raised my wine glass to the empty evening sky and made a toast to the stranger in black clothes who'd helped me remember who I used to be and who I might become again.